Hello, I'm Rob from the Honest Wargamer, and today we're going to be going through all the core rules that you can find in the Warhammer 40,000 10th edition core rulebook. We'll be going through all of the rules in detail and hopefully creating a video that you'll be able to use to learn how to play the game as well as possible. If you don't know what Warhammer 40,000 is as a tabletop game, then here's a quick brief summary. There is an intense and highly detailed setting called Warhammer 40,000. There are multiple books, pieces of art, videos, and all sorts of things detailing this incredible background. Games Workshop and other companies create a series of miniatures based on those characters. Now, I'm not going to go through building and painting those miniatures, but we're going to assume that you've already got there and you are now ready to play a game of Warhammer 40,000. This will be the first in a series of videos. We'll try to break down each section in following videos in the future, but for now, these are all the core rules for Warhammer 40,000, and I really hope you enjoy the video. Let's run through the basics you'll need to play a game of 40k. You'll need some miniatures, obviously. Miniatures form groups of models called units. A unit is either a standalone model, like a dreadnought, or it's a collection of models together, like a unit of intercessors. Through this explainer and through the game, you'll either be talking about models individually or units. You'll need a tape measure because everything here in England is measured in inches. Six-sided dice, try to make sure the symbols are on sixes, and don't use small dice because small dice are for creeps. And you'll need some tokens for like command points or something like that. There are obviously loads more useful tools that you can get to play the game. Combat gauges are very useful. 9-inch measuring sticks are also super great, as well as just a variety of different tokens and cards. But the basics are some dice, a tape measure, some miniatures, and off you go. Your units have all their rules and basically how they work on something called a datasheet. These datasheets can be found in your codexes and also can be found online. I'm going to run through the datasheet now and explain everything you need to know about what's on a datasheet. At first look, it obviously looks like a lot of information, but don't be too daunted. Every unit in the game has a datasheet, and this makes it very easy to understand because all of these rules are fairly universal. Going across the top line, you have the name of the unit, and in this example, it's example datasheet. The M stands for movement. This represents its movement value and how far it can move. In this case, it moves 5 inches. T stands for toughness, and it represents how difficult it will be to wound the model with different weapons. SV stands for its save characteristic. This represents the armor characteristic of the model versus other saves we'll talk about later. The lower, the better. A 2+ armor save in this case is the best you can get in the game. The W stands for the wounds characteristic. This is how much damage it's going to require to kill a model from the unit. If the unit only has one model, and let's say it has 7 wounds, you would need to do 7 damage to kill it. However, a unit of intercessors, for example, they have a wounds value of 2. Each model in the unit requires 2 damage to kill, so it has 2 wounds each. The leadership characteristic represents bravery. The lower it is, the better it is. If a rule does require you to take a leadership test, you roll it on 2d6, and if you roll higher or equal to the leadership value of your unit, then the test is passed. So the lower the leadership, the better the leadership. The average result on 2d6 is a 7. So 7 is an average leadership, and everything below that is better, and everything above that is way worse. And finally, the OC value stands for objective control. This represents how much each model in the unit counts towards holding an objective on the battlefield. You win games in Warhammer 40,000 in 2 ways. The first way is to hold objectives, and the second way is to complete secondary missions. Secondary missions will change every chapter approved, but how you hold objectives will be pretty much always the same. An objective marker is 40 millimeters wide. Models can count towards controlling that objective if they're within 3 inches of the objective marker horizontally or 5 inches of the objective marker vertically. If we go look at the datasheet again, we can see that units have an OC value. Each model in that unit is worth that objective control value. So to determine the control of an objective, you count up all of your models within 3 inches of the objective marker, multiplied by their objective control value. In order to hold the objective, your total needs to be higher than your opponent's. Don't forget, no models can stand on top of an objective marker. So to recap, objectives are just areas on the board where if you get within 3 inches, your models will be able to contest it. And to work out how many that is, you look at how many models are within range and you look at the objective control value on their data sheets. Next up, we're going to look at the weapons on the datasheet, and this will tell you what the unit is armed with and also what those weapons do. In our first example, we have a ranged weapon, which lets you know that it can shoot. Most of the time, weapons are broken down into 2 categories, ranged weapons and melee weapons. Ranged weapons are obviously going to be used in the shooting phase, and melee weapons will be used in the combat phase. Looking at the ranged weapon first, we're going to look at our example weapon. The pistol keyword will tell you what special rule the weapon has. The range stat represents how far the model can shoot from where it is to another model. A represents attacks, and it lets you know how many attacks you'll be rolling for that weapon. BS represents ballistic skill, and it lets you know how easy or how difficult it is to shoot with that weapon. S represents strength, and this is what you'll measure against a unit's toughness to see how difficult or how easy it is to wound that unit. AP stands for armor penetration. The more armor penetration that your unit has, the more difficult it will be for your opponent to make save rolls. And finally, the damage represents how much damage each individual attack does. As you can see, our other example weapons have different stat blocks and indeed different keywords on them. Again, while daunting looking at this for the first time, this is universal across all of the weapons, and so once you learn it, it's something you can learn for every different unit in the game. To the bottom left and bottom right of the datasheet, you can see the keywords, and these are great because they're a really easy way to identify what rules apply or will be applied from these units. Keywords are either broken down into key keywords, which you can find in the bottom left-hand corner, or faction-specific keywords, which you can find on the right-hand side. They're simply just a quick and easy way to reference rules. You might have a weapon or an ability that works very well against infantry. That's where you would go to look to see if the unit you're trying to apply that effect to has the infantry keyword. In our example, it does, so that rule would work. Faction keywords on the right-hand side are almost going to always relate to how you build your army and also your faction-specific abilities. Now let's talk about abilities. On the right-hand side, we have the ability section. Core abilities are universal special rules. They're a special rule that applies to this unit on this datasheet, and it's just a quick shorthand for a very commonly found rule. Faction abilities are special rules that you can find in your codex for your army. They're a special rule that will apply to your unit specifically because you've taken a certain army. Looking at the Malignant Plaguecaster from the Death Guard army, you can see that unit has a couple of abilities which make it do psychic attacks. These abilities make up the flavor of the units. They're effectively the narrative being translated into rules to make it so that you can play them on the tabletop much better. So to quickly recap, you get core rules from the core book, then you get your special army rules from your codex, and then your datasheet or your unit will have its own special cool rules to make it add some flavor or narrative to how the unit works. Lots of these rules are described as aura abilities. The aura keyword simply means that the special rule that is the aura affects all models or units around the range of the aura. Obviously, a model or unit is always within range of its own aura. Units can be affected by multiple different auras, but if you have the same aura, it can't affect the same unit twice. Some datasheets will also just say what the Wargear rules are. So this is just the equipment that they're armed with, which sometimes you'll pay points for, sometimes you won't, and what special rules will apply to that Wargear. Some weapons and abilities have the psychic keyword. This means if any wounds were done with a psychic attack, they're considered to be, unsurprisingly, psychic attacks. 40k and wargaming are like this. You sometimes just have to be very specific, but psychic keyword, psychic attack. Sometimes you'll see random characteristics for a value. The move characteristic may be 2d6, which means when you decide it's going to move, you roll 2d6, determine the value, and then move the model that far. However, if you have a weapon profile that is d3 attacks, you would determine the value of each individual model by rolling individually for them. So that's a basic data sheet. You've got the keywords at the bottom, you've got all the stat block at the top left, abilities on the right, and then weapons in the middle. There are keywords that you're going to find on data sheets that can be very relevant to the rest of the game, so I'm going to talk about them now just so you can work out what's happening. Some character data sheets will have the leader keyword. Later, when we talk about deploying your army, we'll talk about the fact that your leader units can attach themselves to a bodyguard unit, but we'll get into the details later. Some units may have the lone operative keyword, and unless it's attached to a unit, like we just talked about with the leaders, you won't be able to shoot it unless you're within 12 inches of it on the table. Some units will have the stealth keyword. This means if you make a ranged attack against it, then you'll have to -1 to those rolls. That's pretty much everything you're likely to find on the front of the datasheet. The back of the datasheet describes how you compose that unit. On the right-hand side, the unit composition will show you how many of those models are meant to be in a unit. In our example, our minimum unit size is 5, with 1 Space Marine Sergeant and 4 Space Marines. But we can have up to an additional 5 more Space Marines, making it up to a unit of 10. It then goes on to tell us that every model in this unit is equipped with a bolt pistol and a bolt gun. This refers to the weapon profiles that we saw on the front of the datasheet. On the left-hand side, you can see all of the Wargear options. Almost all of these Wargear options will cost points to change or upgrade. This is especially daunting daunting for some datasheets as there are so many options, and is discussed a lot online on exactly what the correct loadout for your models are. Before you build those models, I definitely would take the time to look through what people are saying you should put on them, because you don't want to put a terrible weapon on your model. It's just rubbish. Although you could choose the cool one, I guess. These Wargear options describe what weapons you can change out and also what restrictions to changing those weapons are. And that's quick, brief, simple rundown of a datasheet. I know that seems complicated, but pretty much all of the rules that you'll need for finding out what your units do are located there. So it's a quick, simple reference guide. So we know roughly what our units do, where the keywords are located, and where all the information is. It's our datasheet. Let's talk about some core concepts. Each unit costs points. Those points will be located most likely in an app or online or in your codex. The Wargear for those models will also cost points. Special upgrades may also cost points as well. But we'll talk more about that when we get to building your army. Unit coherency is the first core concept we are going to talk about. It's a rule describing how your models and units need to move around the board. Unit coherency only affects units with 2 or more models. If you have between 2 and 6 models, your models need to be within 2 inches of another model from that unit. Don't forget you measure from base to base. 5 inches vertically to another model in that unit. If your unit has 7 or more models, then each model in the unit needs to be within 2 inches of 2 or more models, and similarly within 5 inches vertically of 2 more models. If for some reason a model can't be set up in coherency, it is destroyed. And at the end of every turn, if a unit is not in coherency, the controlling player of that unit must remove models one by one until the unit again gets into coherency. To recap, unit coherency affects how multi-model units work. You must maintain coherency amongst all your units, otherwise those models or maybe the whole unit will be destroyed. Later we'll cover the movement phase, and you'll move each model individually in a unit, and maintaining coherency at the end of that movement is going to be very important. Core concept of destroying units. When all of the models from a unit have lost all of their wounds, the single model in the unit has lost all of its wounds, it's considered destroyed. This is some really useful wording you're going to see through the rest of the rules that describes units being removed from the board because of damage that's been done to them. So to recap, destroyed units are just models that have died. Units that have died, sad. Hopefully none of your units are destroyed. Engagement range represents being in close combat with enemy models. While you're within 1 inch horizontally and 5 inches vertically of an enemy model or unit, you will be in engagement range. Models cannot be set up or end a normal move, advanced move, or a fallback move within engagement range of an enemy model. And if you cannot meet that condition, that model is destroyed. So to recap, being within engagement range, which is 1 inch of an enemy model or 5 inches vertically, means you're in close combat. This is going to affect moving, shooting, and a load of other things we'll talk about later. A core concept of playing Warhammer 40,000 is using dice, and we use D6, which are 6-sided dice. Sometimes this will be referred to as a D3. A D3 result on a 6-sided dice is if you roll a 1 or a 2, it's a 1, a 3 or 4, and it's a 2, 5 and a 6, and it's a 3. Some special rules will let you re-roll the result of a dice. You can never re-roll the result of a re-roll, and if a rule allows you to re-roll several dice that were added together, like a 2d6 or a 3d6, you must re-roll all of those dice at the same time. Some dice are referred to as unmodified dice. So a rule may be asking you for the result of an unmodified dice roll, which means these are after rerolls have happened but before modifiers are applied. Modifiers are just things like plus or minus 1. So to recap, you can't reroll dice for a second time. Rerolls are applied before any modifiers. Unmodified dice are the result of dice after rerolls but before modifiers are applied. And if you're rolling dice like 2d6 or 3d6, you must reroll all of them together. The final core concept is sequencing, and this is quite important, especially when rules overlap each other. When you're playing a game, you may find that 2 rules are going to be resolved at the same time. If this does happen, whoever is currently taking the turn gets to choose the order in which they happen. If this happens before or after the battle, or at the start and the end of a battle round, then the players roll off to see who gets the choice. I guess the final core concept is how you win the game. And obviously we don't really know how to move models around yet or play, but it's worth talking about very quickly. You win the game by scoring points. You normally do that by holding objectives or completing secondary missions. Holding objectives is normally a point on the board which you'll move all your models towards and hopefully have more objective control than your opponent. Also, the best way to win the game is to have a fun time and enjoy it with your friends. Competitive high-end play is really valuable and a very good part of Warhammer 40,000. So while those people competing in events are also having loads of fun, you can have just as much fun rolling some dice around and having a good time. When playing an army on the tabletop, you are going to need to write an army list. There are some rules for how you build your army, and they're going to change with different chapter approves and also with points and balance updates. So to make sure this video will apply for most of 10th edition, here are the basics that the core rules point out. First thing you have to do is note that one army roster is your faction. What I'm saying is basically you have to be Tyranids, or you have to be Space Marines, or you have to be Necrons, but you secretly want to be Orcs. And inside that army list or army, you can only choose models that have that faction keyword. We talked about that already, but they can be located on the data sheets in the bottom right hand corner. So you choose an army, Sisters of Battle let's say, choose a detachment, and then all models including your army can only be from Sisters of Battle. To have a legal army, you must have at least one character unit. You can include up to 6 dedicated transport or battle line data sheets of the same name in an army, and for every other data sheet of the same name in the army, you can only have a maximum of 3. If you're paying for upgrades or enhancements on your units, then you need to make sure you note that down on your army roster. There's so much more detail to go into when building legal lists, especially if you're trying to build 2,000 point match playlists. But we're not going to cover that today, we're going to cover that in another video. If you just want to get started playing Warhammer 40,000, take a character, take a couple of battle line units, take a couple of other data sheets, and just push them around and have some fun. Okay, so now we know where all the rules for our units are located. We roughly know how many points we want to play. Let's get started and put all of our models on the tabletop. The first thing we need to do is set up the battlefield, and then we're going to need to go through the pre-game phases and eventually deployment. So the first part of creating a battlefield is choosing which mission you play. So determine which mission you're going to play, and then you need to set up the terrain. Terrain is something we're going to cover later. There's lots of keywords and rules for the terrain, and eventually either Games Workshop or independent tournament organizers are going to produce terrain maps. So you can put your armies down and you can have a pretty fair battlefield. But the highlights are pick a mission and then set up the terrain. Next, you roll a dice to determine who is attacker and defender. The next step is called declare battle formations. This is where you and your opponent will do some key decision points before the game commences. The first thing you do is decide which leader units are attached to which bodyguard units and note them down. The next thing you do is note which units are embarked in which transports and then note that down. Don't forget, if no units are embarked in dedicated transports at the start of the battle, they will be destroyed. And then next, you decide which of your units will start in strategic reserve. And once that's done, both you and your opponent will show each other, and I mean, that sounds like you're flashing. And once that's done, you and your opponent will show each other your selections, and then you will start deployment. Before we do that though, let's talk about strategic reserves, as it's the first time we've brought it up. Strategic reserve units are not deployed at the start of the battle. While declaring battle formations, you decide which units are strategic reserves. Those units are not deployed at the start of the battle. The combined points value of your strategic reserve units can't exceed 25% of your army's total value. So if you're playing a 2,000 point game and your army is 2,000 points, no more than 500 points of your army can be put into strategic reserve. You also cannot put fortifications into strategic reserve. We'll talk more about strategic reserve units when we talk about the movement phase later in the game. But just remember, when you're declaring your battle formations, up to 25% of your army can go into strategic reserve. And before we deploy, we'll talk about the other core abilities and keywords that you'll find in the deployment step. The first one is Deepstrike. Deepstrike represents units that are either tunneling, high altitude jumping in, or even teleporting onto the battlefield. If all models in a unit have the Deepstrike keyword, this means they're going to be able to be set up in reserve during the declare battle formation step. Later on, they'll be able to teleport onto the battlefield in the movement phase. Now we can deploy our armies, and each mission will include some deployment zones where we can place our minis. You'll normally take turns alternating deploying units with your opponent into your deployment zones. During deployment, if every model in one of your units has the Infiltrator keyword, you can deploy them anywhere on the battlefield 9 inches away from the enemy deployment zone and any enemy units. This may be the first time we see sequencing coming into effect. Both players may have Infiltrator units, in which case you'll roll off to determine who gets to put theirs down first. With all models deployed and all units that can be in strategic or normal reserves, you can begin the battle. Each mission will tell you how to determine who has the first turn. This is where our next core keyword ability, Scouts, comes into effect. They'll be able to make a normal move of up to the value listed next to the Scout word. They make that normal move at the beginning of the first battle round. Whoever's going first in the turn will get to make their scout moves first. That move must end 9 inches away from all enemy models. So if a unit has Scout 6 as a keyword, they'll be able to make a 6-inch move at the beginning of the first battle round and must end 9 inches away from enemy models. If those units are embarked in a dedicated transport, that dedicated transport will be able to make that scout move instead. However, that dedicated transport must still stay 9 inches away from enemy models when it finishes that normal move. So quick recap of what we need to do. We need to choose a mission, we need to set all the terrain up, we need to determine the attacker-defender, we need to declare our battle formations where we write down which units are attached, which units are in strategic reserve as well as in deep strike, and which models are put inside transports. Deploy our armies, making sure we put our infiltrating units down, then determine who's taking the first turn, with whoever is taking the first turn moving their scout units first. After both armies are deployed, you are going to take turns to determine who is the winner of the battle. A game of Warhammer 40,000 is broken into battle rounds, normally 5, and each one of those battle rounds is reduced to 2 player turns. We're going to break down the 5 phases that exist in a player turn, introduce all of the special rules that will apply during those turns, so hopefully you'll be able to play through a player turn yourself. Those phases are the command phase, where you generate command points, do command phase abilities, and resolve Battleshock. The movement phase, where you'll move your units and also bring units in from reserve. The shooting phase is where you will shoot all of your guns and use your ranged weapons. The charge phase is where you'll declare and resolve charge moves, bringing your units into engagement range with enemy units. And the fight phase is where all units within engagement range of enemy units will fight. Breaking down the command phase, it breaks down into 2 different steps. The first step is where you generate command points. Both players receive 1 command point at the beginning of each command phase. Command points are a resource that you collect and spend on stratagems. Stratagems are abilities and rules that you can apply to your units or in-game, but they require a resource, unlike other abilities that you see listed on datasheets. We'll talk about those stratagems later. Next, you resolve any other abilities that happen in command phase. These are abilities that you can find on things like datasheets or in your codex. An example would be Rabuti Gilliman. Rabuti. On the right hand side of the Primarch's datasheet, you can see he has the ability, the author of the codex, which happens inside the command phase. The next step in the command phase is the Battleshock step. You take a Battleshock test for each unit in your army on the battlefield that is below half strength. Units have a starting strength and they have a below half strength status. Starting strength effectively determines how many models are in the unit when you start the battle. Below half strength is defined differently for units of models, let's say intercessors, and a single model like a dreadnought. You are below half strength for a single model unit if you have less than half the wounds that it has on its wounds characteristic. As an example, the Hecaton Land Fortress, which has a wounds characteristic of 16, would be below half strength if it had 7 or less wounds. For units that have 2 or more models in it, that unit is defined as being below half strength if the number of models inside the unit are less than the starting strength. An example of this would be a unit of 10 Cadian shock troopers. They have a starting strength of 10, but while below 5, they will be at below half strength. An advanced rule to do with starting strength units comes in the form of attached units. If you remember earlier when we talked about the data sheets, we talked about some units that have the character keyword also having the leader ability. This lets them merge with other units known as bodyguard units. So in determining the starting strength of that unit, how do you do it? All you do is add all of the starting strengths of the units together, and that forms your new starting strength. So if you have a unit of 10 infantry and 1 leader attached to it, it now has a starting value of 11. If, however, all of those 10 models in the bodyguard unit are destroyed, then that single leader reverts to a starting strength of 1. Take us back, we are in the command phase. We've just generated our command points and done command phase abilities. Now we're into the Battleshock step, and we now know which units are under half strength, and we're going to do a Battleshock test for them. You do this by rolling 2 dice and adding the results together. If they're equal to or higher than your unit's leadership, then you've passed the Battleshock test. If you fail, that unit is now Battleshocked. Battleshock affects units in a couple of ways. The first thing it does, it makes it so that its objective control value is reduced to 0. Objective control is found on your datasheet, and this means that the unit will no longer be able to contest objectives. You contest objectives by counting up the number of models and the value of their objective control value to generate a number, and that number is how much you control an objective. Battle-shocked units must also make desperate escape tests if they fall back. That won't become relevant till later, so we'll discuss that when it comes up. So to recap the command phase, both players gain a command point, resolve any other command phase rules, take a Battleshock test for each one of your units that's below half strength. Battleshock units have an objective control value value of 0 and cannot be affected by stratagems. And battle-shocked units must make desperate escape tests if they fall back. Now we've gained command of the command phase, it's time to move into the movement phase. Decent, that was good. The movement phase is broken into 2 steps, moving units and reinforcements. The first one we'll look at is moving units. When a unit makes a move, it can make a normal move, an advanced move, or it can remain stationary. Units that start the movement phase in engagement range with an enemy unit can either fall back or remain stationary. To determine how far that unit can move, look on its datasheet and look at the movement value. It can move up to or less than its movement value. Don't forget that unit has to maintain coherency at the end of that movement, and that unit cannot move within engagement range of any enemy models. If you'd like your units to move faster, you can make an advanced move. This is exactly like a normal move, however, you add the result of a d6 in inches onto the movement value. As an example, if you'd like to advance a unit that moves 6 inches, you roll a dice and you determine the value. Let's say the value is 3. This means the unit can now move 9 inches. It has to end its movement in coherency. It cannot move within engagement range of enemy models, and because this unit advanced, it cannot shoot or charge this turn. So this will make your units quicker, but they are far less effective on the battlefield. Move the models in any order in which you wish. You can rotate those models as you move them, but you can never move a model further than its movement value. No part of its base can be moved across enemy models or across the edge of the battlefield. It can, however, be moved over friendly models as if they were not there, but you cannot finish your move on top of a friendly model's base. However, there is an exception to this: monsters and vehicles. These models cannot be moved over friendly monsters and vehicles, and instead you must move around them. But this does mean that infantry is going to be able to move across monsters and vehicles as long as it makes the full movement and goes past its base. If a model doesn't have a base, however, make sure you clear all parts of that model when moving. So to recap movement, you can make a normal move, which is the movement value you can find on the datasheet. You can pass through friendly models, but you can't pass over enemy models. If you're a monster or you are a vehicle, you cannot pass over friendly monster or vehicles, but if you are infantry or other models, you will be able to pass over your friendly monsters or vehicles. You can advance by adding d6 inches onto your movement value, but you can no longer shoot or charge after an advance. Now let's talk about moving over terrain. Models can move over terrain that's less than 2 inches in height. However, if a piece of terrain is over 2 inches in height, models cannot pass through it. However, they can climb up and down it. You measure the distance to the bottom of the terrain feature, and then you measure the vertical distance and move the model on top. We'll talk about moving through and around terrain later on when we talk about terrain in detail. But quick TLDR is you move across terrain that's less than 2 inches, or you move up and down the height of the terrain in inches. If you begin the movement phase in engagement range with the enemy, then you will be doing a fallback move. A fallback move is just like a normal move. You move up to the maximum distance you're allowed to by looking at your datasheet. Units that do fall back cannot shoot or charge in that turn. When you do a fallback move, you must make sure that you finish that fallback move outside of engagement range of the enemy and that your unit maintains coherency. Models can move over enemy units when they make a fallback move, but when they do so, they must make desperate escape tests. This doesn't include units that have the Titanic or fly keywords on their datasheets. If a battle-shocked unit is selected to fall back, then every model in that unit must make a desperate escape test. A desperate escape test is where you roll a dice for each model in the unit that needs to take one, and on a result of 1 to 2, one model from that unit is destroyed. To recap, fallback moves are what you make when you start with engagement range of the enemy. You move your movement value and you cannot shoot or charge after. Models can move over enemy models, but they will have to make a desperate escape test. Every model in a battle-shocked unit has to take a desperate escape test, and desperate escape tests are where you roll dice and any 1s and 2s destroys a model from the unit. Lastly, in the movement phase, let's talk about flying models. Some units on their datasheet will have the fly keyword. Unlike non-flying units, flying models can move over enemy models when they make a normal, advance, or fallback move. Flying models that start or end a move on a terrain feature measure the distance through the air as opposed to along the ground like we see with other units. The next step in the movement phase is reinforcements. This is where you bring your units that were held in reserve because of a special ability like Deepstrike or in strategic reserve onto the battlefield. Reserve units are classed as units that started the battle anywhere else than on the battlefield. When you do bring them onto the tabletop, they always count as having made a normal move. Normally, whatever distance it says they have to be from enemy models when they are brought onto the tabletop is measured horizontally on the ground, and most traditionally this will be 9 inches away. Any reserve units not brought onto the battlefield by the end of the battle battle will be counted as destroyed. Now, these are just the core rules, and probably in match play, this will be changed to if you do not bring the models in by the 4th battle round. So just a quick recap, the reinforcement step is where you bring your reserve units onto the board. Count as having made a normal move, and you measure distances horizontally on the board from enemy models. And lastly, if you do not set them up within a specified time window, they will be destroyed. It's at this point we're going to talk about reserve special rules and also the strategic reserve rules, which we talked about earlier during deployment. During the declare battle formation step, when you were setting up the battlefield and deploying your army, you could decide that 25% of your army made into strategic reserves. During the movement phase, which is where we are now, they can come on as reinforcements, but there are some special rules that apply to strategic reserve units. Strategic reserve units cannot be deployed during the reinforcement step of the movement phase until the 2nd battle round. If you'd like to bring your strategic reserve units on during the 2nd battle round, they must be set up wholly within 6 inches of the battlefield edge, but not within the enemy deployment zone, and 9 inches away from enemy models. From the 3rd battle round onwards, they can be set up wholly within 6 inches of the battle edge, and the restriction not allowing them to deploy into the enemy deployment zone is gone. You still always have to be 9 inches away from enemy models. If you're bringing other units from reserve during the reinforcement step of the movement phase with abilities like Deepstrike, they can arrive from the 1st battle round. And the only restriction on where they can go on the tabletop is they have to be outside of 9 inches of enemy models. So to recap, Deepstriking units can arrive anywhere on the battlefield 9 inches away from the enemy. Strategic reserve units cannot reinforce the battlefield from the 1st battle round. They always have to arrive wholly within 6 inches of the board edge and 9 inches away from the enemy. We moved through the movement phase pretty quickly, and now it's time to pull the trigger on the shooting phase. The shooting phase is where you make ranged attack with weapons, and very much like the combat phase, it's where you're going to apply damage to the enemy. How you apply damage and how you make saves is a long section, so I'm going to do that at the end of the phases. So there are some core rules that you need to apply to shooting units and units making ranged attacks. Before a unit shoots, you must select a target for all of its weapons. Some units will only be equipped with one ranged weapon, but some units may have multiple ranged weapons, and you must decide what all of those weapons are targeting before you start to roll any dice. Shooting is done on a model by model basis. Each one of your models must see one model from the enemy unit in order to shoot it. In this example, we have a unit of 5 intercessors. 3 of those models can see one model from the enemy unit it's trying to shoot. All 3 of those models can fire, but the other 2 cannot. The model of the enemy unit must also be within range of the weapons. 2 of the models from our intercessor unit do have their weapons in range, but our 3rd does not. So 2 can see are in range, and those are the ones that are eligible to shoot. Models in the unit can decide to split their fire. The 3 models that can't see can shoot at a different target. All models in the unit do not have to shoot at the same target. So a unit of 5 intercessors, 2 of them could shoot at one unit, and 3 of them could shoot at a different unit, as long as they can see them and they're within range. However, you cannot split attacks from a unit. If we were to look at a datasheet and it was to only have 2 attacks, all 2 of those attacks must go on the same target. So let's recap and look at a couple of examples. A unit of 5 intercessors with bolt guns can either shoot all of their guns at the same target, or on a model by model basis split their attack. 2 intercessors could shoot at one target while 3 shoot at someone else, but they cannot split the profile of a bolt gun. If we were to take a single model like the Primaris Invicta Tactical Warsuit, you would nominate all of the attacks for all of the weapons it is armed with, and while all the attacks could target one unit, with its heavy flamer targeting a different unit to its bolters. Whatever the situation, all of those weapons need to be in range and be visible to an enemy target in order to shoot them. If your unit is shooting at multiple enemy units, you resolve all attacks against one enemy unit before moving on to the next enemy unit. If you're shooting with multiple weapon profiles, you resolve all attacks made with one profile before you resolve the next profile. All of these attacks, though, are considered to have happened at the same time. So even if you were to fire 2 different weapon profiles at one enemy unit, if that weapon was in range when selected to fire, even though some casualties may have been resolved because of the cause of other weapons, you can still fire those weapons. While this is fairly dull, I know, sequencing is quite important in shooting. Mainly because 40k has lots of different units with loads of different weapon profiles. But to do a quick recap, resolve all the attacks against one unit first, resolve the results of all weapon profile before you move on to the next weapon profile, and as long as when you choose your weapons to attack, they were in range of an enemy unit, they'll always be able to attack while you're resolving your attacks. Next up, let's talk about shooting into combat. Your units cannot shoot while within engagement range of enemy units. Similarly, you don't want to shoot at your friends, so you cannot shoot at enemy units that are within engagement range of your friendly units. So you can't shoot while you're within engagement range, and you can't shoot at enemy units while they're within engagement range of your friends. This is different for monsters and vehicles. You can shoot at monsters and vehicles while they're within engagement range of enemy units, and those monsters and vehicles can shoot while they're within engagement range. However, in both cases, -1 to hit applies to those hit rolls, unless you're shooting with a keyword pistol weapon, which is a keyword on a weapon profile, which means you can shoot in engagement range. So to recap, you can shoot at monsters and vehicles, they can shoot into combat, and pistol weapons let you do all of it. However, those monsters and vehicles are -1 to be hit and also to shoot. We've shotgunned our way through that section, and now it's time to rush into the charge phase. Charge phase is where you make your models get into engagement range with the enemy so you can fight them in close combat. But let's remember, some units are not going to be able to charge. Units that advanced or fell back cannot charge. Units that are currently in engagement range can also not charge. Also, aircraft can't charge. In order to declare a charge, you must pick a unit that's within 12 inches, but it does not need to be visible to the charging unit. Then you roll 2d6. If the roll isn't high enough to get within engagement range of the enemy unit, which is an inch, while maintaining unit coherency, then the charge fails. You cannot move within engagement range of an enemy unit that was not a target of the charge. If a charge is successful, each model in the unit can move up to the distance that you rolled on the charge roll. Each enemy model must also attempt to move into base-to-base contact with an enemy model if it can. Also, each model in the charging unit must end up closer to the unit declared as a charge than it was previously. In our example, the Bodyguard veterans are within 12 inches of the Patriarch in order to charge. They roll a 9, which gets them within engagement range of the Patriarch. However, they must stay outside of 1 inch of the Acolyte hybrids, as they did not declare a charge against them. Each model must attempt to move into base-to-base contact, and that is a successful charge. Each time a unit makes a charge move, it gets the Fight First ability. This will become relevant in the combat phase. If you're declaring charges over terrain, it's very much like making normal or advanced moves. You can charge over terrain that's less than 2 inches high. However, terrain that's 2 inches or taller, you must measure up and across the distance of the terrain. If we were to recreate the charge with our Bodyguard veterans, while they are horizontally 9 inches away from the Broodlord, they are unable to complete the charge because they cannot go up the vertical distance as well as across the ground. You can declare more than one target to be the target for a charge. If you are going to perform what we call a multi-charge, then there are some other things to think about. In order to charge multiple units, you must end within engagement range of all of the units you declared as the target of a charge. Let's recap some information from the movement phase earlier. Don't forget, you can't move across enemy models even when making a charge move. You also can't land your models on top of your friendly models or enemy models, and can only be in base-to-base contact. Charging units with the fly keyword is slightly different. Units with the fly keyword can charge over enemy models in the charge move, and flying units that make a charge that end or begin on a piece of terrain measure through the air as opposed to horizontally along the ground. To recap the charge phase, you pick one or more units within 12 inches and roll 2d6. If you get within an inch, which is the engagement range, then you must try to get in base-to-base contact and have all models as close as possible. Can't get within an inch, or as we call it, engagement range, of a unit that you did not declare to charge. Units on foot cannot pass across enemy models, but flying units can pass across enemy models. Units on the ground have to move up and down terrain. Flying units can just measure through the air. And lastly, any units that did successfully do a charge gain the Fight First ability for that turn. We've really charged through that section, and now it's time to battle the fight phase. The fight phase is broken up into 2 steps. Units that can fight first do so, and the second step is remaining combats. Units are eligible to fight in the fight phase if they meet 2 conditions. They need to have either charged that turn, or if it's within engagement range of 1 or more enemy units. In the fight first step, all units that can fight first do so. This will inevitably bring up our sequencing point again. Don't forget, whoever's turn we are on gets to choose the order in which these will happen. All units that are in engagement range will be able to fight, but the fight first ability units will will go first. The Fight First ability is an ability you'll find on many datasheets, and it's also an ability granted to units that have successfully completed a charge in the previous charge phase. After all the Fight First units are fought, you move on to remaining combats. In this step, all eligible units will fight, and this includes any Fight First ability units that were not eligible to fight during the Fight First step. However, they have now become eligible to fight, and so this goes into remaining combats. When one player's unit is eligible to fight, you cannot skip or pass. You must fight with each unit as it's eligible to do so at the step at which it's eligible to do so. No unit can fight more than once per fight phase. At each step, the Fight First and remaining combats, if all of one player's units have fought, then the other player can resolve all of their combats. After a unit has fought and has done its consolidation move, which we'll talk about later, these units are then eligible to fight in the remaining combat step. So to recap quickly, units that charge gain the Fight First ability and are eligible to fight, and other units within engagement range are also eligible to fight. Fight First units fight first during the first step of the fight phase, and remaining combats are units that are still engaged but don't have the Fight First ability. New units may be brought into the remaining combat step, and you also resolve those combats. So let's look what happens when you pick a unit to fight. The first thing that happens is pile-in move. You pick every model in your unit that isn't already in base-to-base contact, and you move it towards the closest enemy model. If it's possible to get into base-to-base contact with that model, then you must try to do so. The unit must end this pile-in move within coherency and within engagement range of one enemy unit. The pile-in move is a great opportunity to get more models to be able to swing and fight at your opponent's models. Let's look at who is eligible to make a close combat attack from a unit when it's selected to fight. A model from a unit can fight if it's within engagement range of an enemy model. A model can also fight if it's in base-to-base contact with another model from its own unit that's in base-to-base contact with an enemy unit. Once you've worked out which models can attack, you work out how many attacks that unit is going to be able to do. Going back to the datasheet and looking at one of the melee weapons, you'll see the attacks characteristic will determine how many attacks can be made with each melee weapon. Once you've generated all the attacks with your unit and you've picked your targets, you resolve all the attacks targeted at one unit before you would move on to another unit. You would resolve all attacks with the same weapon profile before you moved on to a different weapon profile. And all attacks that you have generated into a target unit are still resolved even if there are still no models left in engagement range with your unit. So to recap, you generate attacks with models that are in base-to-base contact with an enemy unit, or models that are in base-to-base contact with models from their own unit that are in base-to-base contact with the enemy. You can split melee attacks between different units if you wish. You resolve all attacks against one unit before you move on to the next. You resolve all attacks with one weapon profile before you move on to the next weapon profile, and even if there are no models left in engagement range, once you've selected all of the weapons in a unit to attack, you resolve all of those attacks. After a unit has completed all of its attacks, it can consolidate. A consolidation move is up to 3 inches. In order to consolidate, each model in your unit must move towards the closest enemy unit and end up in base-to-base contact. Your unit must obviously end in coherency and end within engagement range of at least one enemy unit. If this is not possible, each model can move towards the closest objective marker. But this must result in the unit being within range of the objective marker and still in unit coherency. If none of those are possible, then the unit cannot make a consolidation move. So to recap the combat phase, units with the Fight First ability fight then, and then you do the remaining combats. You select each unit to fight as it's eligible. They can attempt to make pile-in moves. You generate the number of attacks based on the number of models in range to do so. You resolve those attacks, and then afterwards you make the consolidation move. And that's one whole battle round. Command phase to the fight phase. But we have lots more to cover. We need to talk about applying damage, transports, terrain, and much more. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank everyone on the Honest Wargamer Patreon. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to spend the past few days working our asses off to try and make this video as good as possible. We really hope you're enjoying it, and if you do like what you see, then please do support us on the show. Obviously, also like and subscribe. Obviously, also share with your friends. In this section, we're going to talk about doing damage. We're going to be talking about rolling to hit, rolling to wound, armor saves, ward saves, feel no pains, and all of the process and how it works. Let's very quickly go through the phases for creating damage. First, you generate the number of attacks that you have. Next, you roll to hit, then you roll to wound. Then you make an armor save or an invulnerable save. Then you multiply out the damage, and then you do feel no pains. Lastly, you apply that damage to models until those models and units are destroyed. The first step is generating attacks. If we look at our example datasheet, you can see that our ranged weapon, our example weapon that's rapid fire 1, it's got a 24-inch range and it has 2 attacks. This means if I've got 5 models in the unit, I generate 10 attacks. Super simple. The example weapon pistol has got a 12-inch range but has D3 attacks. If you had 5 models in the unit, you would roll 5d3 to determine the value of the number of attacks that you have. If you look at the melee weapon, you can see that our melee weapon has got 4 attacks. This is what we mean by generating attacks and working out how many attacks that you have for your unit in either the shooting or the combat phase. The second step is rolling to hit. A ranged weapon has a BS or ballistic skill profile, and a melee weapon has a WS or weapon skill profile. In either case, you need to hit. You roll a d6 and you roll equal to or above the weapon skill or ballistic skill profile. If it was a ballistic skill of 3+, 3, 4, 5, and 6 would be a success, and a 1 and 2 would be a fail. Rolls of a 1 always fail, and a roll of a 6 is a critical hit. These cannot be modified by more than plus or minus 1. So the process goes, you would roll to hit with a d6, you would re-roll it if you get the opportunity to, and if you have to, you apply a +1 or a -1 negative modifier to that roll. Take out all your failures, keep all your successes, and move on to the wound roll. Rolling to wound requires a little bit of math, but it's the strength of the weapon versus the toughness of the target. With all your dice that you've hit your enemy with, you roll them to wound. If the strength of your weapon is 2 times higher than the enemy unit's toughness, you only require a 2+ to wound. If the strength of your weapon is greater than the enemy's toughness, you require a 3+ to wound. If the strength of your weapon is equal to the enemy's toughness, it's a 4. If the strength is less than the enemy's toughness, it requires a 5. And if the strength is half or less than half of the enemy's toughness, you require a 6 to wound. Unmodified wound rolls of a 1 are always a fail. Wound rolls, like to hit rolls, can't be modified by +1 or -1. If you roll a 6 to wound, then you will cause a critical wound. Critical wounds, like critical hits, can be modified, and these again will trigger special other effects and special weapon abilities. Once you've rolled to hit and you've rolled to wound, your opponent needs to make either an armor save or an invulnerable save. Your opponent gets to choose which one they'd like to make, and obviously they'll choose the better one. Armor saves and invulnerable saves are slightly different. An armor save can have armor penetration applied to it. If the attacks have no armor penetration, which is the AP value you can find on a datasheet, then you would roll the armor save that you can find on your datasheet. Roll an armor save for each successful wound your opponent did, and roll equal to or above your armor save. If your opponent has armor penetration, then you can modify that armor save roll. If you have an armor save of 3+, then saves of 1 and a 2 will fail. Saves of a 1 do always fail, but a 2 also fails in this case. If your opponent has AP2, then that means that saves of 3 and 4 will also fail. This is where invulnerable saves come in. An invulnerable save is not affected by armor penetration. Similarly, you cannot normally improve invulnerable saves. Our opponent has chosen either an armor or an invulnerable save to take, and then we have our damage. We then look at the damage profile on the weapon that we have either shot or fought with. If it's 1 damage, then for every attack that we've got through, we apply 1 damage to an enemy model. However, if that damage is higher, let's say 2, then we would apply 2 damage to each enemy model. However, before that happens, we have the Feel No Pain step. Feel No Pain is a universal special rule, and it's written as Feel No Pain X. This just means that the different Feel No Pain saves will be different for different units in the game. If it says Feel No Pain 5, you would roll a 5 up to ignore a damage. If it was a 6, you would roll 6. After the Feel No Pain step, this is when you finally start applying damage to models and removing those models from the board. Those models are counted as destroyed. So to go through the process quickly, to recap one more time, you generate attacks, roll to hit, roll to wound, make either armor saves or invulnerable saves, multiply the damage, do Feel No Pains, and then apply the damage. When you apply the damage, you always apply the damage first to a model in a unit that's already taken some wounds. You cannot do excessive or spillover damage. What this means is if a model has 2 wounds and you do 3 damage, then the extra 1 damage does not carry over into the rest of the unit. Instead, that damage is just lost. This is where something called fast rolling comes in, and it's slightly complicated, but I'll try and get through it as quickly as possible. If you were to have a weapon with a damage profile of D3, this means it could either do damage 1 or damage 3. If you were to roll those against a unit that had 2 wounds per model, you wouldn't roll all of the D3 damages at the same time. This is because you, as the person rolling the damage, could effectively apply the damage as quickly as possible to the enemy unit, killing them outright. What I mean by this is if you were to roll a 1 on the first D3, you wouldn't kill the first model. And if you were to roll a 3 on the second one, then you would have wasted 2 pips of damage. If every weapon in your unit is damage 2, then this doesn't matter. There are other cases where fast rolling is important, but honestly, if you're very new to the game, I wouldn't stress about it too much right now. I'll try to make a video on that in detail in the future. I just don't want to get bogged down at this point in the video. There are two more things we need to talk about in the damage process. The first one is mortal wounds. Mortal wounds are interesting because they skip the save roll portion of the process. Instead, you apply the mortal wounds, you multiply out the damage, and then you make your feel no pains, and then apply that damage. And unlike other damage, it can spill over into the unit. In our example, with a unit with 2 wounds, if you were to do 3 mortal wounds, you would destroy one model, and the other mortal wound would carry over and do damage into another model. Mortal wounds are normally done from big scary weapons and things like psychic attacks. Mortal wounds also apply after damage done by normal weapons. Lastly, there is the universal special rule, Deadly Demise. This is often going to be found on vehicles, but maybe also monsters and special unit types. Deadly Demise is a unit effectively exploding. The X value on Deadly Demise represents how many mortal wounds are applied to units within 6 inches. When a unit with the Deadly Demise rule is destroyed, you roll a dice for each unit within 6 inches, and on a 6, it suffers a number of mortal wounds represented by the X value. And that's it for doing damage, whether or not you're in close combat or you're doing ranged attacks. You have normal damage to hit and to wound, save rolls, multiplied damage, and feel no pains. You have normal damage, you have mortal wound damage, and you have deadly demise units. Next, we're going to look at the keywords some weapons have on their datasheets. If we look at our example datasheet, you can see that one of our example weapons has rapid fire. There are lots of different weapon abilities that are going to apply to different weapons, and we're going to go through them all now. Assault weapons are ranged weapons that you can shoot even if the unit advanced. Rapid fire weapons are weapons where you increase the number of attacks that you do while within half range of the unit that you're targeting. The number of attacks that you increase it by is represented by the value after the word rapid fire. Ignore cover weapons mean the target unit does not benefit from cover. Cover is a rule that you get and gives you +1 to your saving throws. Twin link weapons allow you to re-roll the to wound roll for every attack you make with that weapon. A weapon with the pistol keyword allows you to shoot even while you're within engagement range with an enemy unit. You must target a unit that you're in engagement range with and cannot be shot alongside other non-pistol weapons, except by monsters and vehicles. Weapons with the Torrent keyword automatically hit their target and you don't have to roll to hit. Weapons with the lethal hit ability automatically wound the target every time they score a critical hit. To remind ourselves, a critical hit is when you roll a 6 to hit. So lethal hits are 6s automatically wound the unit. Weapons with the lance keyword add +1 to wound to that weapon profile on a turn in which it charged. Weapons with the indirect fire special rule can target units even if they aren't visible. If, however, you do target a unit that is not visible to an indirect fire weapon, then you're -1 to hit with those attacks and the target unit gains the benefit of cover. Weapons with the precision ability can target a character in an attached unit where normally you wouldn't be able to. The character still needs to be visible to the precision weapon. Weapons with the blast keyword add +1 to the number of attacks they generate for every 5 models in the enemy target unit. As an example, a weapon with 2d6 blast attacks that targets a unit with 11 models rolls a 9. You would add +2 to the number of attacks because there are 2 lots of 5 in the enemy unit of 11. This would take you up to 11 attacks. Blast weapons can never be used against a target that's within engagement range of any units from the attacking model's army, including its own. Weapons with the Melta keyword increase the damage applied to the enemy unit based on the value after the word Melta. Melta 2 would add +2 to the damage inflicted by that weapon. Weapons with the heavy keyword gain +1 to hit rolls if the unit that is carrying them remains stationary that turn. After attacking with a weapon with the hazardous keyword, you must take 1 hazardous test for each hazardous weapon that was used. Roll a d6 for each weapon that was used, and on a roll of a 1, one model from that unit is destroyed. If that unit was a character, a monster, or a vehicle, they suffer 3 mortal wounds instead. If that character used a hazardous weapon and was in an attached unit, then the character would suffer 3 mortal wounds instead of the bodyguard unit. A weapon with a devastating wounds ability does mortal wounds equal to the damage characteristic of the weapon if a critical wound is inflicted. A critical wound happens when you roll a 6 to wound. An example would be a weapon that does damage 2. You roll a 6 to wound, that causes a critical wound, which creates a devastating wound, which means it does 2 mortal wounds. I've said wound there a million times. A weapon with a sustained hits ability generates extra hits for every critical hit that you roll, and a critical hit is a roll of a 6. An example weapon with sustained hits 2 means that a roll of a 6 to hit will achieve its initial hit plus 2 bonus additional hits thanks to the sustained hits ability. A weapon with the anti keyword are specifically targeting keywords of other enemy units. Anti-infantry and anti-vehicle are specifically going to work against infantry and vehicles respectively. This means a weapon with anti-infantry 4+, will score a critical wound on a 4+ as opposed to a 6 normally. There's a lot of weapon profiles there, but the key idea is that you have critical hits, 6s to hit, and critical wounds, 6s to wound. These integrate really nicely with the keywords that we've been talking about already, and just means you got to do a bit of cross-referencing to see how they work. Some characters have the leader keyword. Those leaders can be attached to bodyguard units. Both the leader keyword and the bodyguard keyword can be found on their respective datasheets. During the declare battle formation step, for each leader you have with a corresponding bodyguard unit in your army, you can attach that leader to a bodyguard unit. That leader unit then will be attached to that bodyguard unit for the remainder of the battle. Each bodyguard unit can only have one leader unit. While the bodyguard unit is attached to the leader, it is known as an attached unit. That attached unit is considered to be a singular unit for rules purposes, unless you're dealing with destroyed units rules. You cannot assign any damage to the leader in an attached unit until all of the bodyguard models have been destroyed. And even if the character does have wounds applied to it, you still assign all damage to the bodyguard unit until the bodyguard unit is destroyed. You use the toughness of the bodyguard unit when determining to wound rolls, even if the character has got a different toughness value. When the last model in the bodyguard unit is destroyed, all remaining attacks are applied to the character, and then those are resolved. So to recap, you attach leader units to bodyguard units in the declare battle formation step. They're considered to be a singular unit for rules purposes, with the exception of rules that are applied when units are destroyed. You use the toughness of the bodyguard unit to determine to wound rolls. You assign all damage to the bodyguard unit first, and when the last model in the bodyguard unit is destroyed, you then apply the remaining attacks to the leader. Don't forget, when you do attach a leader to a bodyguard unit, you change the starting strength number of both units. Once a bodyguard unit is destroyed, the character reverts to a starting strength of 1, at which point, if it's below half wounds on its wounds characteristic, you are going to have to roll to see if it's going to be Battleshock. Lots of units in the game are described as transports. Transports is a keyword, and it lets you move units around the battlefield. On the back of a unit's datasheet, it will tell you how many units it can transport. During deployment, while you're in the declare battle formation step, you can set up units in your transport when you deploy them. Similarly, you can set up units inside your transport and put them into tactical reserves. Any dedicated transports in your army list, but do not have any units set up with them at deployment, will immediately be destroyed when the game starts. Let's talk about getting in and out of a transport. A unit can embark inside a transport if it ends a normal, advanced, or fallback move within 3 inches of a transport. And a unit cannot embark and disembark from a transport in the same turn. So in order to get into a transport, you just have to make sure there's capacity inside the transport for the models you want to get inside. Move that unit with either a normal move, advanced move, or a fallback move at the end of the movement phase, and then just trundle around the battlefield. Let's talk about disembarking units from a transport. Units that start your movement phase in a transport can disembark, as long as that transport has not advanced or fallen back. If a unit disembarks from a transport before it moves, it can act normally, meaning it can normal move, advanced move, or even charge. If a unit disembarks after a transport has moved, then it cannot move or charge this turn, but otherwise it can act normally. Disembarking units must be set up wholly within 3 inches of the transport, and you can't set them up within engagement range of an enemy unit. And finally, units that have disembarked this turn cannot remain stationary. To recap, units can disembark before a transport moves and then move and charge. However, if a transport moves, you can still get a unit out and it can shoot, but it won't be able to move or charge. You've always got to set those units up wholly within 3 inches, and they will not count as stationary. Some transports have the special rule firing deck. This means you can choose a number of missile weapons up to the firing deck value, and that transport counts as having those weapons when it makes shooting attacks. Let's talk about what happens when a transport is destroyed. If a transport is destroyed, all units inside must disembark. You roll a dice for each model that was inside, and for each roll of a 1, that model's unit suffers a mortal wound. Until the start of its controlling player's command phase, the disembarking unit will be battleshocked, which means it will count for 0 for contesting objectives, and you won't be able to issue it with stratagems. And until the end of that turn, disembarking unit will count as having made a normal move and cannot charge. Sometimes you might not be able to disembark your unit because there are models surrounding it. In this case, you've got to make an emergency disembarkation. Unlike a normal disembarkation, an emergency disembarkation means you must set the models up wholly within 6 inches of the transport. You still roll a dice for each model that has to emergency disembark, but instead of taking a mortal wound on a 1, that unit takes a mortal wound on a 1 to 3. Any disembarking models that cannot be set up will be destroyed. And don't forget, you can't disembark and set up with inside engagement range of an enemy unit. The next unit type we're going to talk about are aircraft, and these work quite differently to most of the other units in the game. During the declare battle formation step, where you attach characters to units and declare strategic reserves, aircraft must be set up in reserve, and for rules purposes, they're treated as strategic reserve units. Only units that are placed into reserves can be set up inside aircraft transports, which themselves, of course, are in reserves. Aircraft move differently to other units in the game. Aircraft can only make a normal move, and can do so even if they start within the engagement range of an enemy unit. Aircraft can only move straight forward and must make a minimum move of 20 inches. At the end of that move, they can make up to a 90-degree pivot. Aircraft that cross the edge of the battlefield or cannot make their minimum move are set up into strategic reserve. It's worth recapping that strategic reserve units can only arrive from turn 2, and when they do arrive, they can only ever set up wholly within 6 inches of a board edge. Let's talk about aircraft and combat. Only units with the fly keyword can get into engagement range with an aircraft. Aircraft themselves cannot charge, pile in, or consolidate, and they can only make melee attacks against units with the fly keyword. And when models pile in, unless it has the keyword fly, you can ignore units with the keyword aircraft for the purposes of piling in towards the closest enemy model. So to summarize, only flying units can fight aircraft, and aircraft themselves can't fight other aircraft in close combat, and they also can't fight or charge flying units. Some aircraft have the hover ability listed on their datasheet. During the declare battle formation step, you must declare which of your units with this ability are going to be hovering. If a model is in hover mode, its movement characteristic gets changed to 20 inches and it loses the aircraft keyword and all rules associated with being an aircraft. Models that are hovering do not start in reserve, but you can choose to put them into strategic reserve if you want to. Lastly, let's talk about how aircraft affect other units on the ground. Normally, a unit wouldn't be able to make a normal move or an advanced move if it was within engagement range of an enemy unit. But if that enemy unit has the keyword aircraft and it's the only unit they're within range of, you can still make a normal or advanced move. So they're basically just not there. You still obviously can't end your movement on top of its base or the model, and you must pass through it. Models can also move within the engagement range of an enemy aircraft as long as the model that you're trying to do that with doesn't have the keyword fly. And models can move over aircraft when they make any kind of move. Don't forget, you still always have to finish a move over its base. So to summarize aircraft, they can only move 20 inches in one direction with a 90-degree pivot after. They effectively don't count for purposes of being on the board if you're on the ground. And units with the fly keyword can charge them and fight them, but the aircraft can't charge and fight them. In this next section, we're going to talk about terrain types. We're going to talk about visibility of models in terrain and the game generally, and we're going to talk about cover. Terrain maps, and how it interacts with the game is one of those really valuable subjects that I think absolutely no one cares about. I care about it. I think it's really important. I've talked about it a lot on loads of different shows, and if you notice, this is the only editorial piece in the entire video. That's how important I think it is. So the only thing I can say about terrain, other than tell you what terrain is going to be like in 10th edition, is to tell you that you should use a lot of terrain in your games, and it will make your games far more fun. Let's talk about determining visibility of models in the game. For ranged attacks, as well as a bunch of different abilities, you're going to need to establish if a model or if a unit is visible. Models also being fully visible or units being fully visible is also going to be something you're going to need to identify as well. A model is defined as visible if one model can see any part of that model. Even if most of it is obscured by some piece of terrain, it is still visible if you can see a part of it. A unit is visible if one model in that unit can be seen, even if it's partially obscured. As long as you can see one model in the unit is visible. If one model can see the whole of another model, then that model is considered to be fully visible. And if every model in a unit can be fully seen by another model, then that unit is considered to be fully visible. These distinctions are important. They're going to affect range attacks and loads of other abilities in the game. Now let's talk about cover. Terrain and terrain types are going to affect units and possibly give them the benefit of cover. If a unit is benefiting from cover, you add +1 to the save rolls from ranged attacks for that unit. Units with an armor save of 3+ or better do not benefit from cover if the enemy weapon that is attacking them has an armor penetration value of 0. And if for some reason you can get multiple instances of cover on a unit, they are not going to stack. So cover is a rule that your units can benefit from, but only once, and it does not apply to high armor save units against low AP attacks. Before we look at terrain types, let's quickly refresh ourselves on how moving through terrain works. If you make a normal move, advanced move, or even a fallback move through terrain, as long as that piece of terrain is below 2 inches in height, then you can just basically ignore it. However, if that piece of terrain is over 2 inches tall, you're going to have to use your movement value to move up and across it. And all of those terrains impact your units and army in different ways. When you're setting up a board at home, or if you're playing a game with your friends, just decide what the terrain is and what categories it falls into. First piece of terrain is craters and rubble. This is terrain lower than 2 inches and can be moved across like normal. Craters and rubbles have normal visibility rules applied to them. If an infantry unit is on top of a piece of terrain like this, they gain the benefit of cover from ranged attacks. The next piece of terrain is barricades and fuel pipes. Models can move up, down, but they cannot be set up or end a movement on top of a piece of terrain like this. Normal visibility rules apply to barricades and fuel pipes. If an enemy unit you're trying to charge is within 1 inch of one of these pieces of terrain, the engagement range is extended to 2 inches. So when you declare a charge and then try to get inside of the engagement range, you can get in within 2 inches as opposed to getting within 1 inch normally. Also, in the fight phase, where normally you would need to be within 1 inch to be able to attack a unit, if the enemy unit is within 1 inch of that piece of terrain, you can attack from 2 inches away rather than 1 inch. Each time a ranged attack is made against an infantry unit that's wholly within 3 inches of a terrain feature like this, if the unit in the terrain feature is not fully visible to the attacking unit, then that unit gains the benefit of cover. The woods feature has a footprint that you and your opponent agree on at the beginning of the game. You can move over this terrain feature like normal. Woods terrain features have a drastic effect on visibility. Models and units that are wholly within this terrain feature are never considered to be fully visible. Also, if a unit must look through the woods to draw visibility to another unit, that other unit is never considered visible. This means that it will gain the benefit of cover. The only exception to this are aircraft and towering keyword units. Draw line of sight to them and from them just like normal. Models that are wholly within this terrain feature can always see out of this terrain feature normally. So to recap, if you have to draw line of sight through a woods, then effectively the unit on the other side gains the benefit of cover. This doesn't affect aircraft or towering units, but if you're wholly within the terrain feature, you gain the benefit of cover and your opponents won't. Battlefield debris and statuary. Models can move up, down, and over this type of terrain, but it cannot be set up or end a move on top of it. And each time a ranged attack is used against a unit that is partially obscured to the unit making the ranged attack by one of these terrain features, they gain the benefit of cover. Hills, industrial structures, sealed buildings, and armored containers. These terrain features are raised areas that units can be set up on top of or finish a move on top of. No model from the unit can have a base that overhangs this terrain feature though. If you're using the hill terrain feature, you can set up another terrain feature on top of it, as long as that terrain feature does not overhang the hill. Normal visibility rules are applied to these terrain features, and when making a ranged attack, if any models are obscured by one of these terrain features, they gain the benefit of cover. Finally, the most common terrain feature in all of 40k, ruins. Ruins have a footprint which the players can agree on at the start of the battle. That footprint extends across the whole of the ground floor of the piece of terrain, and if mounted on a base, that base will count as the boundary of the ruins. Ruins have a special rule called plunging fire. Each time a model that is wholly within this terrain feature and vertically 6 inches from the ground floor attacks an enemy unit that is on the ground floor, you get to add +1 to the armor penetration of that unit. Movement is quite different for this terrain feature as well. Infantry and beast models can move through this terrain feature as if it wasn't there really. However, a model cannot finish its move halfway through a wall or halfway through a floor. Infantry, beast, and fly models can be set up or move to other floors in a ruins. However, the base of none of those models can overhang the edge on any of those floors. Otherwise, it cannot leave the ground floor. Coherency for units has a vertical distance of 5 inches. So you can set up models on the ground floor and have models on other floors of a building. Visibility is very different as well. If this terrain feature is between you and any unit, you cannot see through it. The exception to this is if the unit has the aircraft or towering keywords. Even if that terrain feature has windows on the lower floor, you still can't see through them. Models wholly within this terrain feature can see out of this terrain feature, and units outside of this terrain feature can see into it. So to recap, it just blocks line of sight if you're drawing a line across it. If you're wholly inside of it, then you can see out, and if you're outside, you can see it. Obviously, you still need to actually be able to see those models in order to attack them. Terrain is a really important factor in establishing fun games of Warhammer 40,000. Make sure you use these and engage with the rules well. Ruins will be something you see at pretty much every event you ever go to, so learning how they work will be quite important to be able to play 40k quite well. The last thing we're going to look at are stratagems. Stratagems are special abilities that you can use, but you need to pay a resource called command points in order to do it. Don't forget, at the start of each command phase, both players will gain a command point. And one more rule is that the same stratagem cannot be used more than once per phase. We have the core stratagems from the core rulebook, and there will be stratagems that you can find in your codexes, and I'm sure in things like Chapter Approved. The command reroll costs 1 command point, and it lets you reroll a hit roll, a wound roll, a damage roll, or a saving throw, an advanced roll, charge roll, desperate escape test, a hazardous test, or just after you have rolled the dice to determine the number of attacks made with a weapon for an attack, model, or unit from your army. Counter-offensive is a stratagem that costs 2 command points. Use this stratagem just after your opponent has attacked with a unit. You pick a unit that's within engagement range of an enemy unit, and they can fight next. Epic Challenge is a stratagem that costs 1 command point. Use this stratagem when a character from your army that's within engagement range of an attached unit is selected to fight. Until the end of that phase, all attacks made by that character will gain the Precision special rule. This means that they will be able to target the enemy character in the attached unit. All 3 of those stratagems are usable in either player's turn. These next 3 stratagems are stratagems that you can only use during your turn. Insane Bravery costs 1 command point, and you can use it just after one of your units has failed a Battleshock test. The effect is that unit is treated as having passed the test instead. Grenade stratagem costs 1 command point. You select one of your units with the grenades keyword. Select one enemy unit not within engagement range and within 8 inches of your unit with the grenade keyword. Roll 6 dice, and for every 4+, you'll do a mortal wound to the enemy unit. And the Tank Shock stratagem costs 1 command point. You select a vehicle unit from your army after it's completed a charge move. You select one enemy unit within engagement range of that vehicle, select one of that vehicle's melee weapons, roll a number of dice equal to the strength characteristic of that vehicle, and add +2 to the amount of dice that you're rolling if that vehicle's strength is higher than the opponent's toughness. And for each 5+ you roll on all of those dice, you'll do a mortal wound to the enemy unit, up to a maximum of 6 mortal wounds. These final stratagems are stratagems that you can use in your opponent's turn. Rapid Ingress is a stratagem that costs 1 command point. You use this stratagem at the end of your opponent's movement phase. You pick one of your units that is in reserves, and it can arrive on the battlefield as it would normally during the reinforcement step. You cannot use this stratagem to circumnavigate when one of these units would be able to normally arrive. Fire Overwatch is 1 command point, and you can use this in your opponent's movement phase, charge phase, or when a unit has been set up or has fallen back. You choose one of your units that's within 24 inches of that unit that made the move or setup, and that would be eligible to shoot normally. So a unit that isn't engaged in combat, for instance. Your unit could shoot that unit as if it were the shooting phase. The restriction is you will only be hitting that unit on 6s, irregardless of the ballistic skill of that unit. Go to Ground is a stratagem that costs 1 command point. You use this stratagem in your opponent's shooting phase after they've selected one of your units as a target of attack. The unit that you must select from your army must be the infantry keyword. That unit gains the benefit of cover and a 6+ invulnerable save against shooting attacks for that phase. Smokescreen is a command ability that costs 1 command point. Use this in your opponent's shooting phase after they've selected some targets to attack. If one of the units from your army that they targeted has the smoke keyword, you can use this stratagem. Until the end of the phase, all models in that unit will gain the benefit of cover and the benefit of stealth. The stratagem Heroic Intervention costs 2 command points. Use this in your opponent's charge phase just after your opponent has finished a charge. You choose one unit from your army that's within 6 inches of that charging unit that would be eligible to charge if it was your charge phase. Your unit declares a charge against that unit and only that unit, and can successfully charge them. You can only select a vehicle from your army to do this if it has the Walker keyword, and even if you do successfully charge the enemy, you won't gain the charge bonus for the Always Strikes First ability. You win games in Warhammer 40,000 in 2 ways. The first way is to hold objectives, and the second way is to complete secondary missions. Secondary missions will change every chapter approved, but how you hold objectives will be pretty much always the same. An objective marker is 40 millimeters wide. Models can count towards controlling that objective if they're within 3 inches of the objective marker horizontally or 5 inches of the objective marker vertically. If we go look at the datasheet again, we can see that units have an OC value. Each one of that unit is worth that objective control value. So to determine the control of an objective, you count up all of your models within 3 inches of the objective marker, multiplied by their objective control value. In order to hold the objective, your total needs to be higher than your opponent's. Don't forget, no models can stand on top of an objective marker. So to recap, objectives are just areas on the board where if you get within 3 inches, your models will be able to contest it. And to work out how many that is, you look how many models are within range and you look at the objective control value on their data sheets. That is a lot of core rules to learn, I understand. And hopefully this video was informative and functional. I know it wasn't very zazzy and fun, but a lot of that information is super important, and I was hoping it was a video that you could rewatch time and time again and learn more and more from. I've hopefully put it into an order that makes lots of sense, and hopefully it will help you learn to play games better, which is all we're trying to do here on the show. We plan on making more videos in the future, especially as more publications come out. All of these videos are going to be geared towards helping you learn how to play the game, whether or not you're an experienced player or you're someone who's new. So I hope you can support the show by joining us on Patreon, liking and subscribing and doing all that other stuff. Ultimately, I just want you to enjoy your games of Warhammer 40,000, and I hope this video helps. Thanks very much, and thanks for being honest wargamers.